The morning Honoria Vane arrived at the Dower House, Eleanor had been standing at the library window watching the frost work its way across the lower garden, admiring, as she sometimes did, the quiet industry of cold. She was not yet dressed for callers. She had not expected callers. She had not expected anything except another gray December morning, in a house that was almost but not quite. Still hers, Honoria did not wait to be announced. "You?" She was that kind of woman. She set the small book on the writing desk with the particular deliberateness of someone laying down evidence rather than making a gift. And she let the silence that followed do its work before she spoke. "I found this in the blue room," Honoria said. "In the escritoire your late husband gave you, my brother's escritoire, as it happens." Eleanor looked at the book. She knew it at once. Dark green cloth, the corners worn pale at the edges, the brass lock small and specific, the key to which she had worn on a chain, around her neck every day for 3 years, and which had gone missing, in the confusion of the weeks after the Duke's death. She had told herself it was lost. She had believed, because she needed to believe, that it had simply disappeared in the way small things disappeared in grief. "That is my private diary," Eleanor said. "It is," Honoria agreed with the small smile of someone who has already read everything inside it. "And it is most illuminating, particularly the passages pertaining to my younger brother." The fire was behind Eleanor. The window was ahead of her. The distance between herself and the desk was 4 steps, and she did not move any of them. "Edmund is named in it," Honoria continued. "By name. Quite tenderly in places. I count at least a dozen entries spanning the years of your marriage to my brother Henry. One might almost describe it as a record of attachment. The pause was exactly as long as it needed to be. She is nothing but a widow, with debts, and a diary full of wishes. Bartholomew said to me this morning, I confess I found I could not disagree." Eleanor's hands were at her sides. They did not tremble. She had learned in 5 years of marriage to a quiet and distant duke, and in 18 months of widowhood in a house that was already being arranged around her absence, that the most important thing a woman in her position could do was to keep her hands still. "What is it you want, Honoria?" Honoria picked up the diary and turned it over once, consideringly, as though weighing it. "I want the Dower House," she said. "I have wanted it since Henry married. I want the East Wing furniture, which was my mother's. And I want you to agree, very quietly, to remove yourself from society's view before this particular book becomes the topic of every drawing room in London." She set it down again. "I think those are quite modest requirements, given the alternative." The alternative needed no naming. Eleanor understood it completely. She said nothing. Honoria left the diary on the desk and departed, with the satisfied composure of a woman who believed she had already won. Eleanor stood at the window for a long time after the sound of the carriage had gone. The frost had worked its way almost to the base of the stone wall by now, patient and thorough. The way cold was always patient when warmth had nowhere left to retreat. She did not pick up the diary. She stood where she was, and she thought about the 18 months that had brought her to this particular gray morning, and what she had and what she stood to lose, and whether those two things amounted to the same inventory. The world had decided what she was. A year and a half ago, the season had looked at Eleanor Vane, Dowager Duchess of Ashwick, and found in her exactly what it had always found. A woman whose position was provisional, whose fortune was encumbered by 3 years of her late husband's debts which she had been quietly and methodically addressing, and whose only remaining utility to the drawing rooms of London was, as a cautionary example, she was 27 Merce. She had a face that the season had collectively decided was plain, which she herself had always thought an imprecise verdict on a face that was simply not performing for an audience, and steady hands that she had inherited from her father and that had served her much better than beauty would have done, and a talent for household mathematics that her late husband had found occasionally useful and more often inconvenient. She had also, in 3 years of a marriage to a decent and indifferent man, written things she had not meant for anyone else to read, in a locked book she had believed was safe. The dower house was hers by the terms of the settlement, and would remain hers as long as she chose to occupy it, and did not remarry without the estate's permission, a permission that would now be given or withheld by a distant cousin who had never troubled himself to learn her name. The East Wing furniture was a different matter. The East Wing furniture was a question of whose word one chose to believe about what had been promised at the time of the marriage, and Eleanor's word on the subject was not, in Honoria's estimation, particularly worth believing. The diary on the desk was small. She had carried it for 3 years in a leather case. She had made herself stitching the case shut on both ends, so it would not catch on anything in a drawer. She had written in it, late at night, after Henry had retired to his rooms, in the particular privacy of a house that was full of people who did not pay attention to her. She had been honest in it. It had been the only space in which she was entirely honest, and she had believed it was safe, and it was not. 14 months before Henry's death, she had written, setting it down in her own hand. He looked at me across the table. At dinner tonight, Edmund did, and I could not account for what I felt. It was not what I ought to feel. I am well aware. I am setting it down here because I have nowhere else to put it, and because writing it makes it real. And making it real is the only way I know to set it outside myself, where it cannot do any further mischief. She had been faithful to Henry in every way that could be measured. She had been faithful in all the ways that could not be measured as well. That was the truth. The diary held the truth. It was merely the kind of truth that could destroy her anyway. Edmund Vane arrived at the Dower House 3 days later. He did not send a card. He rode from his own estate 12 miles north in the kind of December cold that most gentlemen would have considered unreasonable, and he arrived in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and a look on his face that Eleanor had catalogued over the years without meaning to. It was the look of a man who understood perfectly well what he was walking into and had decided that, understanding it was insufficient reason to stay home. He was 34. He was not. The Duke of Ashwick, that title had passed to a second cousin in the north who had visited twice and shown no interest in the people or the land. Edmund was Lord Edmund Vane. Younger brother, modest estate, good name, the kind of authority that came not from rank but from character. Eleanor had thought for some years that it was a considerably more durable kind. He had kept his distance during the marriage, not rudely, not obviously, but with the precision of a man who understood that proximity to a certain thing required a careful and constant management. He had attended Christmas. He had attended the funerals of people who required his attendance. He had been present when his brother needed him present, and absent most of the rest of the time. And Eleanor had noticed and understood it in the way one understood things one was not supposed to understand, as a form of courtesy extended to all parties. Mrs. Paget brought tea and departed with the specific discretion of a housekeeper who had been managing this household for 30 years and knew when a conversation was going to need room. "I have heard from Honoria," Edmund said once the door had closed. "I imagine you have," Eleanor said. "I should like to know what you intend to do," she told him. She told him all of it, plainly without embellishment, because Edmund was the kind of man who could receive information without using it as an occasion to perform his reactions. And she found that quality, the current circumstances, very close to essential. She described the diary. She described what Honoria had said. She described the alternatives as she understood them with the same clarity she brought to the household accounts. Here is the present situation. Here is the cost. Here is what it will look like in 6 months if nothing changes. Edmund listened without interrupting. His hands were around the teacup. His face was still as water that has not yet been disturbed. When she had finished, he said, "The diary is yours. The entries are yours. Honoria has no legal title to either." "No," Eleanor agreed. "She has social title, which is considerably more useful." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will speak to Heaton." Heaton was her solicitor. That he knew the name meant he had been paying more attention to her affairs than she had been aware of, which she filed away to think about later. It was the following afternoon that he witnessed the scene with Mrs. Paget. Honoria had returned, uninvited, with Bartholomew Crail at her side, a solicitor of the other kind, the kind who had been useful to Honoria's branch of the family for 30 years and who wore his complicity as comfortably as his coat. They had come in through the front door before anyone could think to prevent it, and proceeded toward the kitchen passage on the grounds that Honoria wished to make an inventory of the household silver, which was, as inventories went, a usefully legalistic excuse to establish the right of access. Mrs. Paget blocked the doorway. She did it quietly. She did it with the full force of 30 years of service, and without a single raised syllable, standing squarely in the passage door with her hands at her sides and her face set in an expression of complete immovability. And she said to Honoria that she would require a written instruction from the estate solicitor, Mr. Runch. Heaton, she named him before allowing any inventory not explicitly authorized by the Dowager Duchess. Honoria made a speech. It was a practiced speech, the kind that had worked in previous iterations, covering the provenance of the kitchen silver, the history of the house, the question of who had the authority to instruct whom, the intimation, delivered politely, that Mrs. Paget's own position was not so secure as she might have supposed it. She concluded by informing Mrs. Paget that her services would not be required past the new year. Eleanor had arrived in the kitchen passage during the speech. She had heard most of it. She said to Crail, "You have no authority in this house. I will ask you to wait in the hall." He looked at Honoria. Honoria gave him a signal. He went. The sound of his footsteps on the hall floor was the sound of a man who has suddenly understood that he has been the smaller figure in the room. Eleanor said to Honoria, without heat, without anything except the particular precision of a woman who has done her arithmetic, "Mrs. Paget is in my employment. Any conversation about that employment is to be directed to me. I believe you know the way to the drawing room." Honoria left. Her departure had a different quality than her entrance. Mrs. Paget exhaled once softly and said, "Thank you, Your Grace." Edmund had been standing at the far end of the passage the entire time, coat still on from the stables, mud still on his boots. He had not intervened. He had not needed to. He had been there, which was a form of witness she was aware of even with her back to him. When she turned, he was looking at her with an expression she did not examine directly. She had catalogued that particular expression over the years, too, the way one catalogued a thing one had decided not to use, and she looked away from it now as she had learned to look away from it before. The passage was cold. The floor was stone. The small window at the end of it showed a sky the color of pewter. And the light it cast was thin and flat, and entirely without flattery. She went back to her accounts. He went back to whatever he had been doing in the stables. Neither of them said anything about what had just occurred. He did not keep his distance after that in the same way he had kept it before. He stayed. He managed the solicitors with the brisk, undemonstrative efficiency of a man who had always done his own work and found no dignity lost in it. He rode to the village and back twice in a single week, on errands she had not asked him to perform. He was present in the library in the evenings, which was where she spent her evenings, reading or doing accounts, and he read in the chair opposite and asked her occasionally a practical question. And she answered it, and they sat in the particular quiet of two people who have reached an understanding neither of them is yet going to name. She noticed all of it, and put it away in the same careful place she had put everything else for the last 3 years, which was beginning to feel rather full. If you have ever known what it is to want something you could not name without cost, you will recognize the shape of those days. Stay a little longer. The diary's existence was known only to 3 people for another 3 weeks. Honoria, Crail, and Eleanor. Edmund knew the diary existed. He did not know its specific contents, or rather he had not asked, and she had not told him. And there was a question implicit in the space between those two facts that neither of them had addressed. One evening in the library with the fire running low, and the December dark solid outside the windows, she told him what she had written. She did it the way she did difficult things. She sat across from him and she said, "You should know what is in the diary. In the event that Honoria shows it to someone who will tell you, rather than allowing you to be prepared. And she told him, not everything. The substance of everything, which was sufficient, the entries that named him, the entries that said what she had felt and had not acted on. The entries she had written to make a thing real and external, and therefore more manageable, which had worked, which was why she had kept writing them, which was why the diary was now a liability rather than simply a journal. He was quiet for a longer time than was comfortable. You did not act on any of it, he said at last. No, I know that. She looked at the fire. Do you? He stood and crossed to the mantelpiece. She could see the muscles of his shoulders settle and deliberate. The posture of a man working out a sum in his head that has been running unverified for a very long time. I did not trust myself to visit often during the marriage, he said to the mantelpiece. You will have understood why. She said nothing, because saying nothing was the honest response. I am not telling you this to press a claim, he said. He turned from the mantelpiece. His face in the firelight had the quality of something that had been very carefully composed for a long time, and was now, at close range, slightly less composed than it appeared from the other side of the room. I am telling you because you have just told me a considerable truth, at considerable cost, and I owe you the corresponding one. A pause. I was in love with you before Henry married you. I said nothing, because he was my brother, and he wanted you, and he was a good man. That is the whole of it. I have not found it particularly difficult to manage, because nothing was ever said, and nothing ever happened, and that is how it was going to remain. Eleanor looked at him across the library in the firelight, and thought, with the particular precision of a woman who has been careful for a very long time, that this was the moment she was going to remember when she was very old. Henry knew, she said, or suspected. He told me once, very obliquely, that he was glad his brother visited rarely. A pause. He was not unkind about it, Edmund said, I know. He told me something similar, his jaw was tight. He was not unkind to me about it either. I did not deserve that. She understood, then, the weight he had been carrying. Not guilt for any action, but guilt for the simpler and more stubborn fact of having felt something that could not be unfelt, and of having watched his brother die knowing that the feeling had existed on both sides of the marriage, and had been responsible for no damage at all, and that the absence of damage somehow made the weight worse rather than better. The wound was not violence. It was the particular grief of having been entirely loyal and finding that loyalty both correct and cold. It was the grief of knowing that one's best action and one's worst feeling had occupied the same years without ever resolving into anything she or Henry or he himself could point to and call a cause. She looked at the mantelpiece beside him. There was a miniature there in a small oval frame that she recognized. It was Henry's portrait from before the marriage, painted when he was perhaps 25, before the quietness had fully set into his face. She had placed it there herself, after the funeral, because it had seemed the right thing to do with the small ornamental objects that survived a person and needed somewhere to go. Edmund's gaze followed hers. He looked at it for a long moment. He was a better man than the world gave him occasion to be, he said. It was the first thing he had said about Henry directly, and he said it with the plainness of a man who means exactly what he says and nothing more. Yes, Eleanor said he was. The fire settled. A log shifted and caught again, briefly brighter. She did not cross the library to him. She was not going to do that yet. She said, Edmund, you are a good man. He made a short, unconvinced sound. And then, very briefly, something that was almost not quite the shadow of amusement crossed his face and was gone, and Eleanor noted it and put it away with the rest of it in the place that was growing crowded. The dinner at Lady Marchmont's was the following Thursday. Eleanor had not attended any social occasion of note since the prescribed morning had ended, on the grounds that the season's machinery had never particularly welcomed her, and she had never particularly needed it. Lady Marchmont was different. Lady Marchmont had written twice during the year of mourning, not with the formulaic condolences that everyone had sent in the first weeks, but with 2 small, careful letters in the 2nd and 9th months, the kind written to a specific person rather than to a social category. Eleanor had answered both. The invitation had a handwritten line at the bottom. "I hope very much you will come." Edmund escorted her. In the particular shorthand of the season, this was observed and catalogued immediately upon their entry, the way all things were observed and catalogued in rooms designed for that precise purpose. She wore a gown that was not new dark green wool simply cut, with no ornamentation except the small pearl earrings her father had left her. And she was aware, with the unerring accuracy that 5 years of attendance at such occasions had given her, of exactly how she read in the room, unremarkable, understated. Perhaps a little too self-contained for a widow who ought to be displaying at least some willingness to be interesting. Edmund read differently. He always did. He had the kind of presence that a room simply noted whether it intended to or not, less from rank than from the specific quality of his attention, which was always directed at whatever actually deserved it, and never at anything else. Lady Marchmont greeted Eleanor with a warmth that was genuine and therefore slightly conspicuous, and took her arm for a moment at the door and said, very quietly, "I am very glad you came." And Eleanor thought that whatever else the evening became, this particular moment had been worth the carriage ride. The dinner table seated 18. Eleanor was placed between a charming, retired general who wanted to discuss the Peninsular Campaign and a younger woman who was in her second season, and found Eleanor's composure slightly alarming, which was a reaction Eleanor had encountered often enough to navigate comfortably. The food was good. The wine was better. The conversation at her end of the table was the sort of conversation that passed pleasantly, without requiring too much of anyone. Lady Deering was 3 seats down and across. She was a handsome, capable woman of 50, who had been a particular friend of Honoria's for 20 years, and who gathered information with the focused pleasure of a naturalist, and who had apparently received a communication from someone in Honoria's confidence. Because as the fish course was removed, and the soup arrived, Eleanor heard her say to the woman at her right hand in the carrying half-murmur that was not quite quiet enough, "One hears she kept a diary full of wishes about the brother, quite embarrassing for everyone." Eleanor heard it. The woman to whom it was addressed heard it. The general heard it, and had the grace to look suddenly interested in his soup. Several others heard it, as Lady Deering had certainly intended they should. The table did not stop moving. The soup arrived. No one said anything directly. Edmund, at Eleanor's left, placed his wine-glass down with the particular care of a man who was not going to do anything precipitate. "You heard that," he said into the space beside her ear. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" It was not quite a question. It was the thing he said, instead of reaching for her hand, which he was not going to do, which was entirely correct, which she was grateful for and sorry about in simultaneous measure, that she found somewhat inconvenient. "I am perfectly all right," she said. "Pass the salt, if you would." He reached for the shaker. In passing it, his fingers touched hers briefly at the transfer, the way 2 people touched things in transit when they were being very careful. And the care itself had begun to take on a weight, and Eleanor's pulse did something that she categorized and set aside with the same efficiency she applied to everything she could not currently afford to feel. She kept her hands entirely still through the rest of the soup. He watched her across the table's geometry through the rest of the evening. She did not look back at him directly. Her body knew exactly where he was at every moment without looking, which was, she thought, an inconvenient thing to know about oneself. And also, now that the diary had been read by people who meant her harm. Not particularly the secret she had been keeping it as. The darkness came on a Monday. Mrs. Paget arrived at Eleanor's dressing room in the early morning, with a face that said, before she opened her mouth, that what she was about to say was going to require steadiness to receive. "The staff are talking," she said. "I think it has come from below stairs at Honoria's house. They're saying—" She stopped, and began again. "They're saying you are the one who wished yourself into the wrong man's arms. I am sorry to tell you. I thought you should hear it from me before you heard it in a way that was intended to wound." Eleanor thanked her. She thanked her as specifically as she could because Mrs. Paget had taken a risk in coming, and Eleanor was not unaware of it. Mrs. Paget withdrew. Eleanor sat at her dressing table for some time, looking at the woman in the mirror. and the woman in the mirror looked back at her with the steady expression of someone who had known, for 3 weeks, that this moment was coming, and had simply not yet met it. The diary was no longer a private threat. It was circulating. Not in full, not yet, perhaps never in full. The full text was dull and entirely devoid of incident, because nothing had ever happened. Because she had been meticulous about nothing ever happening. The shape of it, the flavor of it, the particular social pleasure of a widow who had kept a diary about her husband's brother. All of it sounded so much worse in rumor than it was in fact. By nightfall, there would be calling cards declined. By the end of the week, certain invitations would not arrive. And Edmund's reputation was as much at stake as hers. Possibly more so because the world was consistently more willing to destroy the reputation of a man who had done nothing than to inconvenience the one who had engineered the destruction. He had a good name. He had built it carefully over 34 years, through the specific and unglamorous means of keeping his word, managing his estate honestly, and being the kind of man that other men trusted with things that mattered. A rumor of this kind in the hands of Honoria's circle, given enough dinner tables and enough months, could make him the villain of a story in which he had never been anything but the man who stayed away. He had stayed away. He had stayed away for 5 years, and 18 months after that, and the staying away had amounted to nothing against a locked diary that told the truth in the wrong hands. She thought about Edmund for a long time that morning. She thought about what it would mean for his name to be attached publicly to hers. Not as the man she was intending to marry, not as the man who had behaved with absolute propriety across a decade of proximity, but as the figure in a widow's diary, the name that appeared 12 times in a locked book, tender and unacted upon, and therefore precisely as incriminating as anything that had actually occurred. Because the season did not distinguish between desire and conduct when the opportunity for gossip was equal, she thought about what it had cost him to keep away, and what it would cost him not to be allowed the return. She sent him a note. She wrote it plainly, briefly, without ornamentation. I think it is better, given the current circumstances, if we do not spend further time in company. I do not wish to make your situation more difficult than I already have. She sent it before she could find a reason not to. This took approximately 11 minutes, during which she sat at the writing desk and held the pen without moving it, and then moved it, and did not allow herself to cross it out. His reply arrived within the hour. It was one word: no. She held the note. She set it down on the writing desk, in the place where Honoria had put the diary 3 weeks ago. She sat for a long time with a feeling that required no translation. Honoria had engaged Lady Deering's drawing room for a small gathering, the kind that was not quite a dinner and not quite a salon, and was in practice the season's efficient way of gathering witnesses to something that required witnessing. The invitations had been distributed quickly, with the urgency of something planned far longer in advance than the date of distribution suggested. Eleanor attended, because retreat was not, when she examined it honestly, actually available to her. Whatever she did not attend would be described in terms of what she had been afraid to face. Whatever she did not say would be filled in with a version she had not chosen. She had spent 3 years and 18 months managing an absence, and the absence had managed nothing. Edmund was in the hall when she arrived. They had not coordinated this. He was simply there, in a navy tailcoat and white cravat, looking precisely like himself. Which was to say, like a man who had decided what he was going to do, and had made whatever peace needed making with the cost of it. They went in together, and the room turned very slightly, as rooms do when something is about to be resolved. Honoria was in the center of the drawing room. She had the diary. Eleanor had not known she would bring the actual diary, and the sight of it in Honoria's hands landed in her chest as a specific cold thing. She did not let it reach her face. She stood where she was and waited, because she had learned that waiting done correctly was a more effective instrument than almost anything else available to a woman in a room that was not on her side. Honoria addressed the room. She was composed. She was measured. She was entirely in possession of herself. and she said that she thought it was time all of them were quite clear about the situation, that her late brother's widow had kept intimate correspondence of an emotional character regarding her living brother, and that she believed the relevant parties ought to account for themselves. A short silence. The room was very attentive indeed. Edmund crossed it. He did not hurry. He crossed the room with the particular stillness of a man who is not performing his composure, but has simply brought it with him, and he stopped in front of Honoria, and he held out his hand, and Honoria, who had anticipated a great many responses to her speech and had not anticipated this one, found herself handing him the diary before she had decided to do so. He held it for a moment. He looked at the room. "She is my intended," he said. "The diary is private correspondence between us. 11 words. Level and specific and irrevocable." The silence that followed was of an entirely different character than the one that had preceded it. Lady Deering said with the careful precision of someone recalculating a sum that was no longer adding up, "Your intended." "Yes," Edmund said. He looked at Eleanor across the drawing room. His face was still, his eyes were not. She crossed to him because there was nothing else to do, and because her hands were steady, and because she had decided, in the last 30 seconds, that she was finished with managed distances. When she reached him, he held the diary out to her. "She took it," Honoria said from the center of the room. "This is not—" She stopped. She looked at the room and at Edmund, and found she could not finish either sentence. Lady Wrentham, who was 70 years old, and had been watching the proceedings from the edge of the gathering, with the quiet attention of someone who has seen this particular drama in many different costumes over a long life, said simply, "I believe we owe the Dowager Duchess our congratulations." Several people agreed. The room arranged itself around the new information with the brisk efficiency of a body that has collectively decided to be standing somewhere else. Bartholomew Crail was still present. He found that Honoria had moved away from him, and he was now simply a solicitor, standing in the middle of a drawing room, with no particular brief, and a growing understanding that he had aligned himself with the wrong party. Honoria herself stood a moment with a dignity that had become, in 30 seconds, slightly too large for its container. She was not a woman who made scenes. She did not make one now. She simply absorbed the information that the machinery had moved in a direction she had not anticipated, and she received that information with the specific composure of a person who is going to have to revise a great deal of their thinking later in private, and is not yet ready to do it in public. Eleanor watched her move toward the refreshments table and thought without triumph that she would manage. She had been wrong about most of what mattered here, but she would manage. Edmund was beside her. Very quietly, he said, "I should have said something considerably earlier." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I did not wish to presume," he said. "I know," she said. "You have a constitutional difficulty with presuming. It is, in the main, an admirable quality. In this particular circumstance, it was somewhat trying. The corner of his mouth moved. It was a small thing. It was at this point the most significant small thing she had seen in 3 years, and she allowed herself to note it. Mr. Heaton arrived the following Thursday. He was Eleanor's own solicitor, a dry and careful man of 60 who had managed her modest affairs since her father's death, and who confirmed, in the specific and efficient language proper to his office, that there was no instrument by which Honoria could compel Eleanor's removal from the dower house, and that any claim on the East Wing furniture would require a formal petition through channels unlikely to succeed. Edmund sat in the library for the conversation. He said very little. The solicitor said what was necessary and left. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor turned the diary over in her hands. "I should have burned it when I first noticed the key was missing," she said. "Perhaps," Edmund said. "Or you might consider that it has been in its way clarifying." She looked at him. "Clarifying," she said. "I have been waiting for a reasonable occasion," he said, "to tell you that what I said at Lady Deering's was not purely strategic, in case that was something you needed to know." She set the diary on the hearthrug. "Edmund," she said, "I know." He said nothing. The fire said what the fire always says in rooms where something has finally been put in its correct place. She picked up the diary and placed it in the grate, and watched the cloth cover darken and curl, and then catch. It burned very neatly. The pages went quickly, one after another, the ink disappearing before the paper did, and she thought of the entries she had written in the particular privacy of late evenings in a house full of people who did not pay attention to her, and the locked keys she had worn. And the years of careful nothing that had preceded this particular ordinary evening in December, there was grief in watching it burn, not remorse. She had nothing to regret, except perhaps the waste of the careful nothing, which was nothing to regret, but was also not the dominant feeling. The dominant feeling was something closer to relief, and beneath the relief something else, something warmer, which she had not yet allowed herself to name out loud, but which she thought she was going to be allowed to name quite soon. Edmund was beside her on the hearthrug, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him along her left side. Outside the library window, snow had begun to fall, the particular unhurried snow that intended to stay. After a moment he put his hand over hers where it rested on the stone surround, and left it there, and neither of them moved or spoke, and the fire did what fires do when things that were too long locked are finally open. And the snow settled on the upper garden, and the dower house was quiet around them. She thought of what she had written 14 months before Henry's death. He looked at me across the table at dinner tonight, and I could not account for what I felt. She could account for it now. She had been able to account for it for quite some time. She turned her hand over under his, palm up, and he laced his fingers through hers, and the gesture was both entirely new and not new at all. And the ash in the grate was cooling, and the snow fell on, and Mrs. Paget brought tea at 9 and found them still in the library, and said nothing, except that the roads would be impassable by morning if the snow kept on, which was both a practical observation and something else, and left them to it. If this is the kind of story that finds you, leave a thought below. These quiet histories deserve to be remembered. The snow fell all night. By morning the lower garden was white and still. The east wing furniture was in its correct place. The dower house was, for the first time in 18 months, entirely undisputed. The key had been small enough to be lost in the confusion of grief. Eleanor did not need it. Now.